So good evening everybody, and a special warm welcome tonight to our Zoom meeting to you all and to our speaker tonight, who is John Dominic Crossan. On behalf of you all and PCN Britain, I'd like to welcome you, Dom, warmly to tonight's meeting. For many of us, your work has been a powerful and hopeful resource as we've listened to you at conferences and read your books. It's 20 years ago this year that I first met you at St Mark's in Sheffield. I'd been ordained a month, and during training on our reading list appeared Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. And our principal strongly advised us to get ourselves to St Mark's in 2000 to hear Marcus and 2001 to hear you, which we did. And for me, that was a life-changing moment. Your work has been foundational to my ministry. And it was a pleasure that I met you and Sarah and shared a meal in Sheffield when you came again in 2007. By then I was working at St Mark's. I was Adrian's assistant. For many of us, the phrases and concepts from your work have shaped our understanding and exploration of the Bible and the Jesus story, and it's informed our preaching and teaching over the years. Here are a few things that certainly have inspired me. The first thing is, you said, get the history right for the 1st century, and then the 21st century theology will follow. The normalcy of civilization, the way things are, the war, the victory, and the peace, instead of the Christian way, non-violence, justice, and peace. The idea that Jesus is Lord and not Caesar, and the idea of distributive justice, enough for all and no more, that you need to have justice to get equality. Those 4 things keep me going weekly when I'm preparing sermons. And they are ideas that are all the more important in today's cultural context, where Caesar always seems to be Lord, where inequality is such a major problem here and in the US, where violence is always seen as the solution, and there's no peace and no justice. So tonight, welcome. I'm sure we shall be once again be stimulated and enjoy the evening as we have such an opportunity to ask how far your thinking has developed since those days. So I'll hand over to you, Dom, now with the first question.
Well, to those of you who don't know me, and there are a lot of people here tonight, I'm Adrian, and I have the privilege of chairing the PCN trustees. It's great to have you all joining us for this Zoom conversation with Dom. As Sue has indicated, it was back in the year 2000 when I first invited Marcus Borg to a conference in Sheffield. And after the conference, Marcus sat on my settee in the vicarage and said, and I said to him, who can I invite now? He said, well, you better invite my good friend, Dom Crossan. And of course, Dom came the following year, led a brilliant conference, and we knew straight away, of course, we were in the presence of one of the world's greatest biblical scholars. But more than that, we were in the presence of a friend. And therefore, this evening, I'm thrilled that we've been able to welcome Don, and perhaps once more we can wave our welcome to him. Now, tonight, I'm going to try and explain how we're going to curate the questions. We've had a lot of questions, and we can't take them all immediately. So if you have a question, in your mind and you haven't sent a question in, you're free to use the chat line, which you can open up from the bottom menu. If you open up chat, you can put your question in there and you can already see one or two questions. So we can use the chat line as a kind of conversation piece, and Dom will be able to keep his eye on the chat line. The questions we've decided to group in some kind of thematic order. And in a moment, Sarah, our administrator, will put up the first block of questions on screen so that you can see the questions. And they will also then be put into the chat line. And Dom will then go through the questions in turn. He may decide, whoever's asked the question, to engage that person. It's up to Dom. So be prepared if you've asked the question. I'm going to begin then by introducing this block of questions by this kind of comment. And this is to Dominic. Dominic, so much of your work has been a drive and a desire to describe the historical matrix of factors which help us to correctly understand the person of Jesus. So we begin with a group of questions, 2 from Nicola Phelan, 1 from Daphne Pollard, and 1 from Yvonne Carroll. And these questions should now, I hope, appear on screen. Ah, good.
Okay, I do see the first question.
Okay, is that okay, Adrian?
Yep, I can see that. Dom can see that.
See it, yes.
Right, over to you, Dom.
All right, now also to tell people what I'm doing, on my own screen here, I know you can't see it, I have a file open which has the questions in it and the sort of points that I'm going to respond, because what I want to do is to do 2 things. Answer your question and use them to expand on what I want to say. So please allow that, because I don't simply want to answer each question tersely. We'd be over in maybe 15 minutes. I want to try and expand them. So let me pick up the first word, the key word for me, and it was mentioned in Adrian's, matrix. Matrix, by the way, I like it comes from the same root as mother, mater in Greek and Latin. So matrix is feminine. It's crucial for me. It's the background you cannot skip. It's the context you cannot avoid. My editors keep saying, can't you just say context like everyone else? Why do you have to make up a word? Because matrix has no alternative. And we have been very good for 2000 years at talking about background and ignoring it, talking about context and ignoring it. So I want a single word that you can't avoid because there's no alternative. Matrix is the common sense of its own time and place. It's what everyone knows. For example, I'm going to talk to you about Martin Luther King Jr., but nothing about American racism. Nah, can't be done. That's matrix. It ain't background, it ain't context you can skip. Now, let me look at 4 stages of matrix. I'm still now inching my way towards the first question. First of all, you used to read the New Testament and it was Christian. That's kind of the way I learned to do it. You read the Gospels with one another and you put them all together sort of and came up with a nice life of Jesus, and it was all very Christian and very lovely. And that lasted about till after the First World War. I'm going to call that the first historical Jesus, the first real historical Jesus. It was all in the Gospels. All you got to read is put the 4 together and there you had it. After the First World War, for reasons that you can obviously understand, the Holocaust and responsibility for anti-Judaism becoming racial anti-Semitism, we started to talk about, now watch my language, messianic Christic. I'm not using the word Christian because Christian tends to be the way we are today, the 2 separate religions. I'm using Christic, an analogy of messianic. So the messianic Christic Jewish Jesus. Didn't just look at Jesus as Christian, but you looked at him as within a matrix of messianic Christic Judaism. Like there was also Pharisaic Judaism, Messianic Judaism, etc. There was also Messianic Judaism. That lasted, I think, at least that I could see, pretty much dominated the scenario until the 1990s, at least in this question, when everyone said, wait a minute now, wait a minute. What about the Romans? Oh yeah, well, yeah, we kind of needed them to explain Pilate. No, wait a minute. The matrix of Jesus was Messianic Christic Judaism under Romanization. Romanized already in the diaspora for Paul, initial Romanization for Jesus in the homeland. You can't skip the herd of elephants in the room. So it's under Romanization. So it's not enough to keep saying Jesus was a Jew. Of course he was. He was a Jew under Romanization. Now, what I want to introduce is a fourth search for the historical Jesus. Each of these are cumulative. You don't skip the first one, the second one, the third one. Putting history within evolution. And when I use the term evolution, I mean it exactly the way it would be used by a physicist, for example. I mean cosmic evolution, and within cosmic evolution, human evolution. So in other words, what I'm asking now in the wide sense is, what does the historical Jesus or Christianity have to say to human evolution? I'm not saying it is the only one that speaks to it, but every other religion asks its own questions. I'm asking Christian questions because that's who I am. So evolution is the matrix now in which history must be understood. So for example, where I began to see the transition was when I wrote How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian. I was looking very closely at Genesis 2 and 3 and the alleged original sin, despite the fact that Genesis 4, Cain, is the first time sin is ever mentioned. And I began to realize that you couldn't explain Genesis 4 because it was itself a miniature summary of the Neolithic Revolution. So I found myself being pulled back willy-nilly by the Bible, Genesis 4, not Genesis 2 and 3, into evolution. That's where it happened for me. So if you've read How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian, or the later book, Resurrecting Easter, or the future book that's coming out, you'll see that evolution dominates the scene and everything is understood within that. Let me put this up front. I'm packing an awful lot into matrix, I know that. Our species, Homo sapiens, clearly named by someone who has a great sense of humor and knows Latin, because sapiens means wise. Homo sapiens is a social species with individual wills. A social species with individual wills. Most of the other successful global species like ants, bees, termites don't have individual wills, so apparently there are no problems with them. They seem to be doing quite well. We are a social species with individual wills. Please hold on to that, because that is our original state. It's not our original sin, but it is our original state. So we're born of contradiction. And the yawning chasms beneath us are either anarchic individualism, which is now dominant in certain parts of the United States. If you want to see what it's like, just look at CNN. And on the other hand, despotic communalism, let's call it, not communism, or communalism. We're pulled in two directions. That's the first thing that happened to that tiny little community. Let's imagine it as Cain and Abel. So that's the question I'm asking all the time. What does this say within human evolution? How does Christianity track with human evolution, with cosmic evolution? And I would like every other religion to ask the same question. So let me move into the first question. Peasants, picking up the certain terms in there, peasants. Peasants for me are simply farmers, small farmers oppressed by a controlled economy. That's what I mean by it. My paternal grandfather was a small farmer. I wouldn't call him a peasant because he wasn't oppressed by a controlled economy. He just had no money. Nobody stopped him if he could make it. His farm was a hillside with enough grass there for the mule that drew the trap in Donegal and the goat. So I wouldn't call him a peasant because there's not a controlled economy oppressing him. So I build the term oppression into peasants. Otherwise, just call them farmers. And especially it's important because peasants tend to love it to be the same. Change is the most dangerous thing that'll introduce revolt in a peasant society. By change, I mean, to use a UK example, you're allowed to hunt in the forest. All of a sudden, the Lord says you can't hunt in the forest anymore. That's a change. Or you can't graze your sheep on the commons anymore. Any sort of a change is very, very, very dangerous in a peasant society. And the ones who will lead that change may not be the peasants themselves, but the people who had hunted and did well in the forest, or who did have herds to graze on the commons. It may not be the desperately, permanently poor, but the dispossessed. So let me move into another word, Nazareth. I'm packing an awful lot into this first question because it's preliminaries I want out there. Matthew 4:13 says, Jesus left Nazareth, made his home in Capernaum by the sea, by the lake. Why did he do that for? First of all, it's much healthier up in the Nazareth Ridge than down there by the lake shore, because by the lake shore you have mosquitoes, and by mosquitoes you have sickness. No wonder there's so many sick people around Jesus. The Old Testament isn't filled with sick people. The New Testament seems to be. We'll get into other questions about demoniacs called legion. That's a separate issue. Why does he make his home by the sea? Why does he move? Another word, you brought in fishing. Now, here's my challenge. It's a subdivision of history evolution. Get Antipas right. Get Herod Antipas right, and you'll get John the Baptist and Jesus right as two bonuses. Antipas is the man who would be king. To understand Antipas, and I'm not trying to read his mind, but trying to understand what he did. Why did he do what he did? Why, for example, did Antipas decide to move his capital city from inland Sepphoris, again, up there on a nice hill, much more healthy? Why did he decide to move it over around the year 20 in round numbers, or be ready at least to open by the year 20, to Tiberias? Oh yeah, sure. Of course, he was making a nice little polite genuflection to Tiberias, but he could do that a lot quieter by simply, building an amphitheater or building a nice big triumphal gate, or changing the name of Sepphoris to Tiberias. There's lots of ways you can do it without antagonizing everyone by moving your capital. You don't move your capital because it's kind of designed by God, unless you get a hint from God by an earthquake, which is a hint to move your capital, maybe. But you don't move your capital without a strong reason, because it really annoys everyone. It annoys your aristocratic retainers, because what do you do with a used villa on Sepphoris? It annoys the simple alley scribe who comes in from his farm, knows enough writing to do some little contracts. He can't move 20 miles. Everyone's going to be mad. No wonder people said it was built on a graveyard. What's he up to? What is Antipas up to? Hold on to that word, fishing. Antipas had tried to become king of the Jews under Augustus. And Augustus, in 4 BCE, death of Herod the Great, held a solemn convocation, according to Josephus, in the temple of Apollo, of all places, to decide who's going to be king of the Jews. And first candidate was Antipas to be king of the Jews, because the Jews sent a delegation to ask for it, his homeland Jews. The Jews of Rome were for it, Herodian family. And poor Augustus was sent back with his tail between his legs to be a tetrarch, a quarter arch, not a monarch or even a nethnarch, but a quarter arch. All his life thereafter, I understand what he's doing as trying to become king. Under Tiberius, he decides The way to get the Romans to make me king is to up my tax base. If I could do that, they might give me the whole country. How do I up my tax base without pushing my peasants into rebellion? Commercialize the lake, which will become the lake of Tiberias. Fishing. It's exactly those people who had been fishers, peasants, of course, with the added protein from the fishing and were able to do it, could launch a boat, maybe if they had one, could launch a net even. All of a sudden, the lake, like Sherwood Forest, has become privatized. That's why he's there for. He's not there for the breeze. He's there to commercialize the lake. Is that good news? Of course it is for him. So scholars who write lovely books about how the economy boomed under Antipas are absolutely right. But ask not for whom the boom booms, it may not boom for thee. So Jesus then, the huge background for Jesus is, of course, the tradition. All of a sudden, all this lovely stuff you have about peace and justice and beating their swords at the plowshare and all that lovely stuff from the prophets, all that tradition gets traction. You don't have a movement without traction. You may have the lovely tradition that this shouldn't happen, that shouldn't happen, but you have to get traction. Now, one final point on that. That gives you a general fast scenario to why the movement of Jesus gets going, has a huge tradition from the prophets and the Torah, but gets traction. So you have people listening, including somebody like Mary Magdalene, who was terribly important because of the opposition given to her. That tells me why she was so important. She was from Magdala, important enough not to be named by her father or her husband. I understand Mary of Magdala probably had a major fishing business, at the main fishing village before Tiberias was plunked down right next to her. She's a major sponsor, leader, patron of the Jesus movement. I'm not saying she's looking for another job. I'm saying she knows that all this lovely talk about justice, this is what it looks like when injustice arrives. That gives Jesus an audience. The primary audience is not the people who you might call street poor and were always poor and were used to it and had figured out how to get around it. It is the recently impoverished. That's why it's Peter and James and John and Andrew along with Mary. Why is everything on the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee, the northwest quadrant, around the 20s? Stick with Antipas and you'll figure it all out. Okay, next question. Oral tradition. First of all, oral tradition is absolutely functional, not mnemonic. It's not that everyone is memorizing what Jesus said unless it is functional, unless it is programmatic. They're not saying blessed are the poor unless it has a religio-political slogan value. They're not saying, yeah, he said that, I do remember, yeah, that was a good one. He was good at one-liners, that was a really good one. Get on with it. No, there has to be a program behind it. So think functional. Now, your other question about what they would have remembered. Think of the Exodus every year. Don't read the book of Exodus, nothing about that. The festival of Exodus at Passover, basically it's about liberation from Egypt. Did nobody in the first century say, how come we're celebrating liberation from Egypt, which is far away, when we're under the control of Rome, which is right next door? They did ask it because twice in the first century, once in 4 BCE and again in the 50s, there were major riots during Passover in the Temple of Jerusalem, with huge crowds in a small condensed space and only one exit to the south. If anything happened, there could be a riot and people would be trampled to death. So, of course they knew. I mean, a David and Goliath story that everyone would know, even every kid would know. All of that takes, as Shakespeare says, a local habitation and a name. It's like, shh, it's not about the Egyptians. It's about the Romans. Okay. Now, again, remember, we're under the initial years of Romanization. And basically, Romanization usually began with client kings. Rome didn't arrive in usually and take over unless they were ready for it. So Herod the Great represents inaugural Romanization. Think of his giant port at Caesarea Maritima, magnificent port. He's getting with the program, all-weather ports, all-weather roads, all-weather bridges. This is the Roman system. We get around to cities and temples and everything else, but get the infrastructure first. So here's my port. Then for my people, I'll enlarge the temple, 5 soccer fields, north, south, 3 soccer fields, east, west. See, I'm taking care of my Roman client, my Roman bosses. I'm taking care of my people. Herod Antipas doing the same for Galilee. They're getting with the program of Romanization. Again, we can fill that out in greater detail, but that's what's going on. The oral tradition then is what stands powerfully against that. Maybe the scholars like myself will be reading this text and saying, yeah, but on the one hand, and yeah, on the other hand, there's always at least 2 or 3 hands for scholars. So, but it's vastly simple for the people who are depending on oral tradition. We hear the stories, and the stories are always about God delivering God's people. Thank you very much. Could we now have a little more of it right now? Post-resurrection, Jesus and the Holy Spirit, the third question from Daphne. I usually myself never talk about the pre-resurrection Jesus and the post-resurrection Jesus. That was Marcus. And I usually argue with him that I thought that was not like the Big Bang at the resurrection. I thought there is only one Jesus. And Jesus could be seen as the living Jesus that you could meet and talk to, or as the resurrected Jesus. We'll come back to that again. But you're always talking about the same Jesus. It's not a different Jesus. It's the same Jesus seen by the eyes of sight. Pilate could have seen him, or the eyes of faith, but it's the same Jesus. There's only one Jesus crucified in history, but vindicated in metaphor. Now, I use the term vindicated there rather than resurrected, because we're going to have to come back later and see you could be vindicated by ascension or resurrection. Powerfully different metaphors. Let me press that word metaphor, please, because it's the second most powerful word to understand me after matrix. A simple everyday example. Clouds sail across the sky. We all know exactly what's happening. You're imagining this, the sky is blue, so it's like the sea. The clouds are white. They're like sails. Duh. I mean, they sail across the sky. It's a metaphor. It's seeing as. Hyphenate that. Seeing as. And you'd be very annoyed if somebody said, but they really don't sail across the sky, you know? You say, oh, get over it. Seeing as the sun rises, the sun sets, you don't accept to be picked up. We're dynamite on small metaphors, and we're hopeless on big metaphors. If the metaphor gets big enough, we call it reality. And we've forgotten that we're seeing as. We cannot, as human beings, see in any other way than seeing as. Any more than you can look at your mirror and see yourself without seeing yourself seeing yourself. Seeing as is our destiny. Now, metaphor becomes reality when it is lived out. So to put metaphor and the real in opposition is absurd. Metaphor is opposite to the literal, real is opposite to the unreal. Metaphor are the realest things around when you live them out. Example, in the 30s, 2 metaphors, the Third Reich in Germany, let's say, and the New Deal in America. They were both lived out. One worked, the other didn't. Why some metaphors don't work? Once again, does your metaphor track with evolution? There is a transcendental power controlling it, whether you like it or not. There is a reason that empires all last only so long and then are replaced by another empire that thinks it'll last forever. So metaphors become reality. That's how we create reality. Let me see. Oh, you mentioned the Holy Spirit. Here's how I understand the Trinity. Every religion that I can imagine is Trinitarian. That is, it has some referent. Let me say some God or some referent. Could be enlightenment, some referent. That referent is never left invisibly up there in the clouds. It's embodied. Like enlightenment may be embodied in the Buddha or a Bodhisattva. But it has to be diffused to other people. So you've referent, embodiment, diffusion. Put another way, in Christian terms, God is invisible. I haven't seen God. I don't think you have either. You may have had a mystic experience, but that's different. God is invisible. But God is being revealed in Jesus and in the community of the rule of God. That's the Christian faith. Yeah, but that doesn't help me. Jesus is gone. You have Jesus available through his Spirit. That's the ordinary way that I use Spirit. When you talk about somebody in terms of going to a football or soccer match, and you say they've really got the Spirit. Or if somebody said to me, if I were to meet Martin Luther King, which I never had the privilege, and he said to me, I'm going to give you my Spirit. And I would say probably, well, if I took your Spirit, could I end up in jail? Yeah. Could I end up maybe assassinated? Yeah. Okay, I really like your Spirit, but how about 5%? So for Paul, for example, when he says our spirit, our normal human spirit, nothing wrong with it, has been replaced, a sort of a spirit transplant by the Spirit of Christ. For Paul, it takes over the way an operating system takes over your computer. If you're offered an operating system and you hit download, it's going to take over. And trust me, it's not going to make any difference if you don't like it. It's taken over. So for Paul, the Holy Spirit can take over your life and you can't not do what it drives you to do. It's holy, by the way, because distributive justice is always holy in the Bible. What place, role, importance does John Dominic give to Mary, please? Quite appropriate, since I spent 19 years in a religious order dedicated to Mary. I'm going to ask you, let me read to you something I wrote. Okay, I won't do this too often. I asked you to imagine the following thing. One day when he was old enough, Mary took Jesus up to the top of the Nazareth ridge. Springtime, the breeze had cleared the air, wildflowers were already everywhere. Across the valley, Zephyrus gleamed white on its green hill. Mary is speaking. We knew they were coming, but your father had not come home. She's talking, if you don't recognize, about 4 BCE when the legion arrived to destroy Zephyrus. So we waited after the others were gone. Then we heard the noise. The earth trembled a little. We did too, but your father had still not come home. Finally, we saw the dust and we had to flee, but your father never came home. I brought you up here today on the Nazareth Ridge, so you will always remember the day we lost him and what little else we had. We lived, yes, but with these questions. Why did God not defend those who defended God? Where was God the day the Romans came? So I'm taking seriously the fact that Jesus is the son of Mary, that Joseph is never mentioned. I suspect Joseph was dead. In fact, demographically, most fathers were dead. I think, let me think for a second. 1/3 of children by the age of 15 had lost their father in that demographics. So Mary probably brought Jesus up. And I want to know could he possibly have grown up without everyone in that tiny little, you know, village, not knowing what happened when the Romans came? The Romans weren't way over for Jesus there on the Tiber. They were in his backyard when he was born around the same time. So, like me growing up in Ireland, I knew Irish history to the songs. You know, I had the courses and I passed them, of course, and forgot it immediately. But I knew it in the songs. I can't imagine Jesus growing up in Nazareth without everyone talking about the biggest thing in their life, the day the Romans came around the time he was born. So I think he knew all about the Romans. And if they weren't asking questions every time they heard about, as I said, the Egyptians and all the rest of God's history of deliverance, I don't know how they would not. So that's Mary. Now, let me see. I think we are now ready for Adrian to read the second major group. Adrian, is that correct?
That's right, Dominic. So now the next group of questions, Dominic, many people this evening who are taking part in this session have, I'm sure, greatly valued the scholarship and insights you brought over the years. And yet many people see little change in the theology and the teaching and the preaching in our churches. And I think that frustration and disappointment is picked up in this next group of questions. And I'm just going to read the first question out. You can, all of you can be reading the questions, but Nick Jowett's first question: given the fact that in the 21st century, you can still hardly hear a sermon that doesn't A, relate highly mythic gospel passages as though they actually happened, like that, or B, fantasize about what Peter or Mary must have felt, or C, mash together different evangelists' versions of a reported event. Was the work of the Jesus Seminar all in vain? And Nicola picks up that in terms of what's being taught now in seminaries, and Tony picks it up as well. And then Rodney finishes by saying, do we have to, as a result of the Jesus Seminar work, redefine what it means to be a Christian? So Dominic, with those frustrated kind of questions, as it were, and I might ally myself to some of those, over to you.
Yes, and this is a section where I really don't know of any good answer. I mean, what's going on in America with with a lot of religion turned over to the side of politics, it's even worse. But let me say the first thing that I think is most important for me. First of all, my job and your job is not to change the church. Your primary job is to know, speak, and act the truth. Now, I'm not saying that just as a brush off, because I've had to live by that in both scholarship and elsewhere. That my primary job is not to change anyone. If nobody wants to be changed, if all this is, I still have my primary job is to tell the truth as I see it. That's all I can do. That is a primary responsibility. So if that seems flippant, please not. It's fundamental. The Jesus Seminar. Our purpose. Let me go back. Bob Funk, who's the founder of the seminar, what he saw was in scholarship, we could talk about anything we wanted. We could talk in scholarship. Do you think Jesus said the Our Father as it is in Matthew, or did you think Matthew made it up? We could discuss that as long as we wrote it in a scholarly journal or a scholarly meeting. And footnotes, the function of footnotes is the old idea of battlements around the castle. They were to keep everyone away. Bristle with footnotes like you bristle on the battlements. No right-minded person is going to try and read this stuff. So we were safe. He said it's not ethically right for us to be doing this in scholarship and not letting people know we're doing it. I think that's absolutely correct. As soon as he said it, I knew, you're right. You're right. I was thinking to myself, that's probably why classics went down the tube. Nobody cared about them. So I knew in this country especially, the Bible was big in the bad sense of the word, was very big. And yes, especially. So I knew that telling people what we are doing was highly controversial and remedial and therapeutic in this country. So it wasn't just, telling people what we're doing. But it struck me as if doctors had decided years ago, we can't tell people about germs and microbes. Nobody's going to believe it. We can see them, but nobody's going to believe it. So just tell them it's noxious air and we know what to do. So he was right. He asked me to be co-chair. I said, does that mean I have to do anything? He said, no. And I said, that's fine. I'd be co-chair. It was Bob Funk's idea. I think it's absolutely right. It's ethically right. Now, if you think of the people for whom historical Jesus was there already, Norman Perrin left England and came to the University of Chicago because he would never have made it at Oxford or Cambridge. And it had nothing to do with his scholarship. He wasn't an Anglican. So the two people who are most fundamental to this country, Perrin and Funk, were kind of outsiders. Funk was at the University of Montana. If you called up the University of Montana, they always said, the university. They always presumed somebody was calling from inside Montana. I said, no, I'm calling actually from Illinois. So Borg and Crossan, what's weird about them? Borg got his doctorate in Oxford. I got my doctorate in Maynooth in Ireland, National Seminary of Ireland. We weren't properly socialized. If either of us had got our doctorate at Harvard or Yale, maybe, I don't know if we'd been better or worse, but we would have known better than to talk about the historical Jesus or do anything that we did. So it's the outsiders especially who are able to do this. Now, in my own case, round numbers, from 1970 to 1995, I was writing scholarship, including the historical Jesus, which was never meant to be read by any normal human being. The fact that it amazes the publishing world by having people buy $30 500-page book. You see, the royalties are never, you get your royalties when people buy the book. You don't get your royalties on whether they read it or not. And you don't get your royalties whether they finish it or not. So you can never tell. But it really made it clear to me that there was a huge group of people out there ready to pay $30 for a scholarly book. I mean, it didn't have footnotes because I was using a different type of bibliographic method from the social sciences. So it didn't bristle. It just bristled in the appendices. So then I started, because I started being invited to come to churches. But I didn't go to churches and say anything different. I just tried to make it as clear as I could and simple in the sense of staying on the essential stuff, not getting lost and showing how smart I was. So for 25 years, from 1995 to say 2020 in round numbers, COVID came in, obviously, I spoke in churches. Now, I can't not answer negatively, was that all a waste of time? I mean, I had a lovely time, ran up 1,000,000 miles with United. I think something had to happen. Something was happening. But to be honest with you, that was not my function. My function was simply to tell the truth. You want to know about the Bible? I've spent my life studying it. I've spent my life seeing the sites. I've seen the museums. I can tell you about it and tell you what the history is. Now, whether that is all in vain, it's not my experience. But I think what we are getting to is that we are really establishing a dialectic, not a victory. By a dialectic, I mean any two things that can be distinguished but not separated. I'll come back to this again. A dialectic is two sides of a coin. And as you know, we can never see two sides of a coin. Our mind isn't good at dialectic. We don't like dialectic because we have to say crucifixion, resurrection. So we said crucifixion first, so let's put crosses up and forget the resurrection. But a dialectic means you cannot think of one without the other. You can't have a one-sided coin. Well, Jorge Luis Borges wrote a short story about a one-sided coin, but I think it fell on the ground the wrong side down and they couldn't find it. Anyway, a dialectic. So this may be an ongoing struggle. It may be that what we are called to do is to witness to the truth that we see, and whether people take it or not. But to be honest with you, yes, I see too much change, at least in my experience. All right, let me see. One other thing I'd ask say in the second question, the reason I wrote how to read the Christian, how to read the Bible and still be a Christian, I wasn't moving away from the historical Jesus. The point I was making there is that when you know the whole Christian Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation, you realize that Jesus, the historical Jesus, is the norm of the Bible. He's in the center because he's the norm. So I was really interested in having people look at their entire Bible, the entire Christian Bible, and especially the fascinating fact that, let me use the term Old Testament. When I was writing that book, I said, let's skip the term Old Testament, New Testament, just read straight through the Christian Bible as a single text. But if you look at the Old Testament, it was assembled after the exile. And during the exile, the people who returned from exile had experienced the extraordinary phenomenon of going into exile under the Babylonian Empire, and within 50 years being liberated, I use the word liberated, by the Persian Empire. So maybe empires are changing. Maybe the world is getting better. Maybe we can imagine, this is where the whole eschatological vision comes from. I don't think it was there for the whole world before. Maybe things could be better. So they got this vision that empires all have oppressed us, but what we're going to get in the future is not us oppressing everyone, turn around, we should have our own little empire. Phoenicians had it, so why couldn't we? They came up with the idea of a just world. A just world? It's the most extraordinary, anti-self-evident concept that anyone has ever imagined. A just world down here on earth, with the swords beaten into plowshares. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, by the way, not God. So read the Bible and see the tradition that comes roaring out of the Old Testament and the prophets into Jesus and Paul. Okay, let me see. I'm looking at the third one, the conference in England. Well, somebody suggested, would I like to write Progressive Christianity for Dummies? Hi, Tony. Look, I really think the problem is not information, it's commitment. But I don't know, when people tell me how difficult I am to read, if they're talking about my syntax, my vocabulary, or my information. It's not very nice. It's a vision of post-civilization. It's a vision, actually, that this idea that I just spoke about of distributive justice for the whole world in order to find peace is not just a nice ethical idea, but might be an evolutionary imperative, that the alternative is for us to destroy our species. So that's not very nice. It's kind of nice to think that we do lots of foolish things, but there's always forgiveness and there's always mercy. And besides, if we blow it here, we can always go off to heaven or somewhere else. What if there is no? What if we're on the Titanic? So it's a vision of post-civilization that I get when I read that vision of the Torah for Israel, and then you might say Torah for the whole world in the prophets. It's a vision not of barbarism or of civilization, but of post-civilization. So I would ask then, what is the purpose of having a church? Why bother organizing? If you asked that of Jesus and Paul, I think they would look at you and say, what's wrong with you? Rome is organized. It's the best organized empire the world has ever seen. It has this brilliant idea of putting its troops on the periphery, and everything inside the periphery is peaceful. Magnificent idea. Don't keep your troops sitting around waiting to go out in the springtime for looting. You send them on the periphery. You invent bases. You invent a territorial empire. They're organized, Paul would have said. They're organized, Jesus would have said. Why do you think we're moving around? We're organizing. And if you said, well, couldn't we just have private spirituality? We'll all, they would have looked at you kind of amazed, but that's not how Rome runs. It's organized to control you. We're organizing to decontrol you. So that's why I know outrage with organized religion, because we've seen very often it becomes careerism, but organized democracy around in my country, at least here at the moment, is all about careerism. So I'm not quite ready to dismiss community, congregation, organization because of careerism, because otherwise I don't know what organized spirituality would look like when you're up against the imperial normalcy of civilization. And I don't think in the last question that we really redefined Christian. We simply rediscovered it. It's all there. If you read it against its own history, the kingdom of God is exactly the right term. I know it's old-fashioned and male and all the rest of it. It's exactly the right term for Jesus to announce when the kingdom of God is Rome. So we're rediscovering it. All right, I think we're back. I know I'm moving very fast at the moment, but.
Okay, Dominic. Have I been unmuted?
Yep, you're all right.
Am I okay? Okay.
I can hear you.
Right, thanks, Dominic. Now, the next group of questions, for all of us at times, faith is not so much cerebral, but emotional. And today, many people search for spiritual meaning in life. They'd be more interested in the God question, perhaps, Dominic, than the Jesus question, and what that might mean for future life. Now, hence these questions from Tom Hines, Sarah Doyle, and then I've, I'm afraid, poked my nose in and put a question in at the end as well. So Tom asks about prayer. Sarah, from her very sad experience, asks about the afterlife. And I just quote back to you what you've often said: heaven is in good shape, it's earth that's our responsibility. Okay.
All right. Am I okay on time?
Yep.
Let me, I use the term God. Therefore, I have a right to explain to you how I use the term God, because some people have abandoned it. Now, I would ask you to do this as an experiment. Forget any debate about theistic or atheistic or different understandings of God. Let me ask you again to focus on evolution. I ask you to think of evolution the way you think of gravity. It really doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It really doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew. Gravity is completely fair. If four different religious people jump off a 30-story building, the reaction will be exactly the same from the pavement. So I don't know whether you get cerebral or emotional about gravity, or air for that matter. It's available, it's free, it's available for everyone without discrimination. I'd ask you to think of evolution. If you read your Bible from beginning to end, and every time you saw the word God, I'm not making now a final decision, this is an experiment, an initial experiment, cross out mentally the word God, put in the word evolution, and consider it personified. So evolution can talk and say things and everything else, as it works. Read the entire Bible in terms of evolution. Just see if it makes sense to you. Because believe me, it will. Here's what I understand by the term God, as distinct from evolution. I begin with evolution, always. I began with history, now I begin with evolution, which is just history. History is like the waves of, the waves are to the sea as history is to evolution. Let me put it that way. So it's just history writ big. Look at the Big Bang for a moment. Meditate on 3 questions. Now, don't try to answer them because you're not going to be able to answer them. But I think they're unanswerable. They're mysteries. Why is there being rather than nothing? Why is there stuff? Granted there is being, why is it dynamic rather than static? Why don't we just have a world that's there? Doesn't keep changing, just there. And granted being is dynamic rather than static, why is it absolutely fair to everything? Absolutely fair. I'm not too keen on that absolute fairness. I would prefer it was fairer to human beings than to viruses, to be honest with you. But that's up to what we want to spend our money on and how we want to do things. We at least are conscious. If evolution is equally fair to the tornado and the people, but tornadoes can't come in if you get down into the shelter. They won't come in afterwards and open the door. So why is there being rather than nothing? Why is being dynamic rather than static? And why is dynamic being so fair, so just? It looks almost like unconditional love. I am terribly aware that that's Trinitarian. I think that's exactly Trinitarian. And I'm not really the least bit interested in slinking Greek philosophy back in. It just don't know how to get away from it. So when I use the term God, I'm not thinking of a person, I'm thinking of a capital M mystery. I think that is where all human creativity comes from, by the way. The fact that there are no answers to that question. And I realize completely that most people move on fast from the Big Bang. If you want to focus on it and meditate on it. Now, I can't tell you whether that's emotional or cerebral. I can't. But maybe I would suggest that that distinction is part of the problem. That as soon as you decide there are cerebral stuff and emotional stuff, and you can separate them and you can put them, you've already lost the game. In answer, I know when you ask that question about what about somebody, two children aged 21 and 41. First of all, there should be no need. If somebody, what do you say to someone in my position whose two children died aged 21 and 41? I want to know, did they raise a question? Did they raise a problem? If they didn't, why would you raise it to them? If they are perfectly happy and absolutely convinced that they are going off to heaven and they will see them someday there and be perfectly happy for all eternity, I don't think I would draw their attention to the fact that there's more suicides around Christmas when families get together than any other time of the year. I wouldn't draw their attention to whether eternity with their family is exactly what they're looking forward to. That's beside. But who raised the issue? If they're perfectly happy with it? Now, at that stage, it's much too late to raise the issue. What did they say to that person during the preceding years? Were they not told, as I think they should be, that if they ever belonged to the people of God, the communion of saints, the body of Christ, if they ever belonged, they would always belong? Enough. If that isn't enough, the rest is, I'm sorry, transcendental snake oil. There may be a time for narcosis. I understand if I was, in extreme pain and dying, I would certainly want opioids. But there are spiritual opioids, and maybe they have to be given at the last minute when nothing else. But that's when we've allowed it to be too late. If the person raises, asks, questions, doubts, then they haven't been prepared for what can happen. And that means their spiritual education has failed. So now, with regard to the question about afterlife, let me say, and I'm not playing games, I am absolutely committed to an afterlife here on earth. Because the life that we are shaping here on earth I don't think we can survive it as a species. I don't think we can survive it. I know that's trying to be apocalyptic. I'm not at least being apocalyptic. I mean evolutionary. We have the challenges of a species, and we've never faced them. So that's not my interest, but it's not my interest of opposing. I'm not even interested in it. I really don't know for sure, to be absolutely serious, where Jesus was on the afterlife. Not everyone, of course, as you know, the reason the Pharisees had to make such a big fuss about the afterlife is most people didn't believe it. They believed in the older Jewish idea that when you died, you went down to Sheol and it was over and get over it. It was good when it lasted. And the people of God lived on, of course. And it was enough ever to have belonged to the people of God. Everything we know in our New Christian Old Testament pretty much came out from a people who believed it was all over when it was over. Go down to Sheol, which is simply the grave as a condominium complex under the earth or something like that. It's over. Get over it, they would have said. So basically, most Christians seem to be fighting Pharisees, leaving out Paul. And so I'm not sure. But what I do see is that Jesus and Paul, by the way, spend most of their time insisting on how to live on this earth. So maybe Jesus thought there was going to be a heaven and hell and all the rest of it. Paul certainly did as a Pharisee. But neither of them made that the major issue. They just didn't. The major message, say, from Paul isn't you better live a just life because you're all going to hell if you don't. It really wasn't. Let me see. I think I'm going to give it back to you. I think.
Yeah. Okay, Don. Yeah. Let's just change direction for a moment, Dom.
Okay.
Because many people watching and listening today are very conscious that you're speaking, your matrix is very much the USA. And so you've had in your writings and lectures a lot to say about systemic injustice and violence being the normalcy of civilization. And many of us here in the UK have been alarmed by what we've seen in the US in regard to police brutality, the storming of the Capitol, racism, and so on. And indeed, in the UK, there are echoes of this: more polarization, more aggression, more anger. In the epilogue of your book on Jesus and the violence of Scripture, you say that love empowers justice and justice embodies love. Now, how do you feel that's going at present in your country?
All right. Now, you understand I've limited knowledge, but here's what I think. When I look at the UK, what I see is you have a constitutional monarch, which with all its problems gives you at least something that is a unifier. Even if you're all mad at the constitutional monarch, that still unifies you. You have a parliament and you have multiple parties. So you have to learn the parties have to cooperate, because you might have a government with multiple parties. I think you set it up practically over years of experience. The USA set it up all theoretically at one time, and it was a brilliant idea. I think it was a much better idea than your idea, except yours works. So let's have separation and checks and balances. We have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. By the way, I came to this country as a student in 1951, came with the Queen Mary, by the way. It was quite lovely, second class, cabin class on the Queen Mary. I only became a citizen in 1997 when Newt Gingrich, a Republican, I said to Sarah, this country is starting to scare me. I don't think it's safe to be in this country unless you're a citizen. So in 1997, having been here, 47 years minus 6 back in Europe, I became a citizen. Executive, legislative, judicial. It's a lovely idea. Each will balance one another. But then there's two parties. So the president can be, let's say, a Republican. The legislative can be dominated by Republicans. They get to choose the judges. So you've collapsed the beautiful checks and balances into one. Because when you have two parties, why should the party that's in, Why should the party that's out cooperate at all with the party that's in? Don't cooperate. Make them make fools of themselves for 4 years or 8 years, then you'll get in. You can't do that because you have small parties and more parties than two. I don't know whether the fatal flaw in the American system is two parties, because I see the argument that they're making. If the Democrats are in, don't cooperate. Don't help them with anything. Do nothing. Then they'll have failed so dismally, we'll get in. Then it repeats itself, of course, they'll do nothing back. So you have, whether it's said or not, basically a constitutional crisis. Now, my hope is that what we are actually watching is the dying, vicious kicks of one party who has tried to run it that way by non-cooperation and has been pushed farther and farther into the far right wing, because apparently right wings always seem to push themselves farther and farther to the right. So that's what I see. I will tell you after the 2022, if the president, of course, will stay, if the legislature becomes dominated in both parties by the Republicans, then I think Trumpism is here to stay. And the next thing we'll have is a Trump who is a very nice, civilized person who smiles very nicely, never says any rude words, smiles very, very often, but we will have Trumpism without Trump. That is the real danger for the moment. Check back in 2022.
Okay, Dominic. We've got about 20 minutes left. And
Okay.
I know that there are a number of people, when I look at the chat column, have either asked questions or have made comments. And I wonder, one of the earliest questions that came in today before we started was from Paul Onslow. Now,
about 10 years ago, I did a theology degree, and I heard you in Leeds. I think my dissertation was going to be on eschatology, but then I heard you talking about resurrection, and I changed my mind completely. And I read one of your books, The Cross That Spoke. Now, in that book, you argue that the Passion and the resurrection narratives in the 4 canonical Gospels are reworkings of an earlier Gospel, the Gospel of Peter. You also argue as well that a hypothetical Gospel, the Cross Gospel, is redacted within the Gospel of Peter. And it was this Cross Gospel that was a source for Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and then later a source for John, if I've got your understanding correctly. I believe at the time it was widely panned by academics. Do you still consider it correct? And has your thinking changed or moved on at all?
All right, you're quite right. I received a massive consensus on that book of rejection. I achieved something which is not too usual in scholarship, consensus. I think I made a mistake there. I had 3 points. We have a Gospel of Peter, it exists. My first point was that there is within the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Peter is a 2nd century work that tries to collate together the Gospels we have in the New Testament and another source. Now, I should have stopped them in my argument there, because I'm still convinced that other source exists. I made a second one because every time I looked at that second source, I thought it seems to be more primitive than the stuff we have in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Probably was not able to prove that, because I don't know how you'd be able to prove it, to be honest with you. But here's the interesting thing. The scholar who most fully devastated it was Ray Brown in his The Death of the Messiah. But if you read that appendix, he did say, my source, let's call it source X, had a crucifixion, a burial, and a resurrection. Ray said, this is the absolute truth. Ray said, well, I didn't say Crossan is right. He said there is a burial tradition in there that's independent of Matthew. He said there is a resurrection tradition in there that's dependent of Matthew, just those two. And I said, well, if you had a burial and a resurrection, you'd have to have a crucifixion. So there had to be somehow a crucifixion somewhere, and I can see it in there.
Yeah.
And Neerink from the Louvain, who is a very good reader, he really is, said, well, Crossan is right on that. If you accept the two, if you accept B and C, you're going to have to stuck with A. So yes, I still think actually there is in the Gospel of Peter a independent, I'm just going to say, I won't say fundamental, an independent version of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I think that's right. And the way to check it, go into Ray Brown, read very carefully in the appendix, and watch where he says that there is an independent burial tradition in Peter, an independent resurrection tradition in Peter. Then ask that question. There had to be at least somewhere a crucifixion, and why not take the one that's in there? But I think if I had made that, I think there would not be so much alarm, because I've come to decide after 50 years of it that any attempt to say that outside the New Testament, there is an independent source, except for Q, because Q got in early, is it's a hopeless argument.
Right.
It's a hopeless argument. Anything that you find, and I would be willing to argue that statistically even, some of the stuff we find outside the Old Testament, some of it has to be independent, just statistically. But I found out that it's a useless argument, so I focused mostly thereafter on the New Testament itself. But yes, I think in answer to your question, I still think there's an independent source in Peter, and I leave it open for debate about whether anyone in the New Testament knows it or not.
That's great. Thanks, Dominic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Dominic. We've had a couple of questions which are similar to each other. We've just had on the chat line from Peter Lumsden a question about how do we get evangelical Christians to leave the Trump fold? But I also wanted Dominic to mention this email we had from Joanna Morling, who I think is present. And Joanna is saying, has the time come for progressive Christians to fight back against evangelical disinformation? Is it possible for open-minded progressives to be that confrontational? Is it in our nature to be open-minded and therefore not suggest we've all the answers? And how do we speak out about what we believe when we have our own doubts? I hope I got that right, Joanna, and you can come in and see what Dominic says in response. So Dominic, back to you on that.
No, John, I think you're absolutely right, because at least in this country, we have to fight for the possibility of truth. It's all my truth and your truth. It's not your opinion about the truth and my opinion about the truth, which I have no problem with. My interpretation of the truth. But the idea that it's my truth and your truth, and there is no truth, it's all opinion. And then the misinformation. I think the experience in this country at the moment, right now in every state in the country, COVIDs are going up, and there's a pandemic. I saw the word today, pandemic among the unvaccinated. We have a new pandemic with the Delta variant among the unvaccinated. I think we have to start naming misinformation, disinformation, and even when it's conscious lies. I think we're going to have to start using it. Yes, how exactly we'll do it, I don't know. And it has to be done with a positive. Most of my life, I figured I'm not going to bother my time fighting them. I will just keep saying what I think is true. I think we're going to have to start doing that. Now, the good news is that the New York Times, or maybe last week or so, I think you will probably find it on Google, which knows everything. We used to think that was God. It's actually Google. Google is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. right-wing evangelicals, the number that are going down and the number of young people, especially who are not following it, is hopeful, because I think it is misinformation and disinformation. And the fact the way it has colluded with the right-wing political, I think, is part of its demise. So yes, I think we have to say that is wrong more than we've said.
Okay, Joanna, do you want, if you're there, do you want to come back on what Dominic has said?
I do agree, but as I say, it's so difficult when you sort of all you want to say is, well, this is what I believe, but I don't know if it's true, and so it's very hard to make an argument that's more liberal and more progressive sound evangelical. So I suppose what I'm saying is, how do we become evangelical progressives is a problem for us all, and I don't know what the answer is.
Well, I'm going to say I think I do know the answer to that. Whether it works or not is another question. Jesus lived in history. If somebody asked the question, how on earth could Jesus be the Son of God? How could a human being be? I would say, wait a minute. In that century, before Jesus ever existed, and if Jesus never existed, and whether you, dear evangelical, I'm not talking to you, know it or not, there was a human being in the Mediterranean who was called Son of God, God incarnate, Redeemer from sin, Savior of the world, what have I missed? Lord. Those were the titles of Caesar Augustus if Jesus never existed. That is history. It's fact. It's not my interpretation. Now, it would be interpretation if I were to say, we should all follow him. That's interpretation. That's commitment. That's different. But if an evangelical doesn't know that, then they are simply ignorant. I'm sorry. Now, they could say, after you tell them that, some people knew all of that and they said, see, they just called Jesus these names. Everyone was called these names in the first century. It meant nothing. Of course it meant something. Try telling Caesar he wasn't the Lord and see what happens to you. You know, so to say Jesus was Lord in the first century meant that Caesar wasn't. You might as well be in the 1930s in Germany and use an ordinary everyday word like Führer and say Jesus allein unser Führer ist and wonder why you're at Dachau. Because it's an ordinary everyday word, leader. I mean, what's a big deal? But they were picking precisely the right words to say the transcendental value of Jesus. That's what they're claiming, a transcendental value, not just he's a nice guy. They're saying he is somebody to whom we should commit our lives as a way of life. And by saying that, they were committing high treason quietly, delicately, whether we like it or not. That's history. So I think I don't know any other vaccination except history. I think they all need a shot of history, including, Christians who say, well, they're just using common language. No, they weren't using common language. They were using common language when Paul said, our Lord is the Lord. That was treason. When Paul talked about our Lord, yeah, no problem. Rome said, you can all have your little lords and your little gods and your little sons of gods. Oh, it's all lovely. Just don't say it's the Son of God or the Lord. That's treason. And we don't think you're violent, but we pick off your leaders, which is what they did. So I don't know. And maybe, Joanna, there is no possibility. But we should demand, as a fact, that Jesus was not the first person in the first century who was called all these titles. And therefore, what you have to do, I'd say to C.S. Lewis, it's not that Jesus said he was divine, so he was either nuts or he was truth. No, there was two people who said they were divine, Caesar and Christ, or he didn't say it, but people said they were. So now, if you had to choose in the first century, Caesar was divine, Jesus was divine. That's a question of faith, Roman faith or Christian faith, if you will. But you can't use an argument like C.S. Lewis did that Jesus said he was divine, so he had to be insane. All right, it doesn't work. He had a classical education at Oxford. He should have known better. So I think the vaccination they need is history. Maybe it won't work, but we shouldn't give in.
Okay, Dominic, we've gone over such a wide range of questions and you must be exhausted. And in a moment, we're going to formally thank you. But before we do, I want to just look ahead because you seemed so tireless in your writing and in your researching. So just give us a clue as to what's next, what's on the publisher's desk, and what's in your mind. Where's it racing to in the next few months and years?
I don't know if you can you put up, by the way, at all? I sent you a copy of the cover of the book. I have a book in with Harper One. It's called Render to Caesar. You know what that means. And on the cover is the coin of the tribute. So I think the subtitle is The Struggle for God and Culture in the New Testament. The Struggle for God and Culture in the New Testament. Briefly, the first part of it, the overture, is really, what coin are we imagining? Jesus asked, as you know, about what image and what inscription is there. So, and then he talks about, the things of God, the things of Caesar. So the coin that I'm arguing, the only coin I think that is right to argue, is a coin that said, a Greek coin, not the coin that's usually shown, which is a Latin coin, a tiny little one about this size, which nobody could have seen in a magnifying glass. It's a Greek tetradrachma from probably Syria, Antioch, which says 3 words: image of Caesar, Theos, Sebastos, Kaiser. God, Augustus is the Latin term for Sebastos, Caesar. So when Jesus picks up those words, God and Caesar, and separates them, what he's saying, you equated them on the coin, I separate them. So the question then of the book is, in the New Testament, what happens? And thank you, you got it. So you can see if you're reading what, clockwise, is it? Yeah. Theos, I got it right here. Theos over there on the right, and then Sebastos around the bottom, and then Kaiser up the left-hand side. It's a rare coin. There's only about 10 of them extant in the world. The really good ones are all in private ownership. There's one in Australia, but it's very often when they hit the die on it, they missed it. So that's one place where you can actually read it. That's why I got permission to use that coin from the seller. Anyway, so the first part of the book is culture demonized. The response of the book of Revelation: Rome slaughtered Christians and God's coming back soon to slaughter Romans. Sounds fair enough. The alternative is Luke Acts. I'm looking at that as a single 2-volume book. 2 volumes, that's 2 scrolls, 2 books, 1 book, 2 scrolls. And I'm saying that it is culture canonized. What Luke Acts imagines is the future is Roman Christianity, not Jewish Christianity, but Roman Christianity. Luke was the only one in the New Testament who actually got it right, whether you like it or not, because he was making the first steps towards Constantine. So the third question then is, granted we have these 2, polarization within the New Testament, canonization, demonization, where do you go to find out what Jesus thought? I'm not going back into the New Testament because I just found the New Testament tells you whatever you want. So what I did in the third part is I said, let me go to Josephus. New Testament doesn't exist. If we only knew about Jesus in Josephus, the 2 places where he mentions Jesus, what would we have about Jesus? What would we know? And I'm arguing that from Josephus alone, without the New Testament, you would know that in the year between 4 BCE and 66, the Jewish people experimented extensively with nonviolent resistance. This is not Jesus. If he never existed, they were experimenting. It's all in Josephus. Josephus writes through gritted teeth because he hates it, but it's there. Then within that, he says Jesus is the Christ. And Josephus spends a lot of time avoiding eschatology as much as he can because he doesn't want to even mention it, that we are an eschatological nation, that's, in other words, we're programmed for rebellion, Rome might read. So I read from Josephus as the criterion and then ask, where in the New Testament do I see the same thing? And where I see it, of course, is Pilate crucifies Jesus and he doesn't round up his followers, which tells me Pilate's point of view, Jesus is crucified for nonviolent resistance. That's what they did. Get the leader, ignore the followers. And I translate Jesus's love your enemies as nonviolent resistance. The way you love your enemies, don't worry about the word love. Why does Jesus presume you always have enemies? Love your enemies means nonviolent resistance. That's the way you love your enemies. So that's a fast resume of the book. It'll be out, please God, in February of 22. It's in with them now and already is in the process. It's, you know, die is cast at this stage, long cast. So thank me for letting me give you that plug for the book.
No, that's
brilliant.
We wanted to do that, Dominic. I just want to say, folk, a couple of things before I hand over to Martin, who's my fellow trustee, who's going to do the formal thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar with PCN and what it can offer you in terms of the shop and the library, if you go onto the PCN website, you will find under the shop and under the resources a number of ways in which you can follow up what Dom has done for us in the past. And in particular, recordings of conferences and Dom's own recordings in the various video series that have come out of Living the Questions and so on. So do have a look at the PCN website, and Sarah will be putting up on the website this Zoom conference so that we can look back and digest some of the things that Dominic has been saying. So I just thought I'd mention that. The second thing and last thing I want to say to everybody is this is never easy to have this kind of conversation on Zoom. My internet went down tonight halfway through and I lost a load of the chat, so I wasn't able to recover some of that. I think we all know how forbearing we have to be with one another in these situations. But let's face it, we've been able to be at the feet of one of the world's biblical scholars for an hour and a half without Dom leaving his living room, without you and I leaving our living room. Think of the environmental possibilities that we have done in terms of saving the planet by that alone. I'm going to, Don, be in contact with you tomorrow to make my own personal thanks. But now on behalf of PCN, I'm going to hand over to Martin to give our formal thanks.
And thank you very much, Dominic, for your presentation and more so the openness with which you answered the questions. It's a great privilege for me to offer you a vote of thanks for being with us tonight or this afternoon, depending on your time zone. It was thanks to Adrian, who gave a series of talks on Easter some years ago, that I've started to read many of your books as well as Borg. This is a great achievement by you and other authors, to me, because I used to read almost no theology at all, because I thought it was boring. And I found it much less interesting than physics. However, now I read much more theological works than scientific ones. So thank you for that. As far as some of your answers are concerned, just want to pick on three which struck me. One was using the word evolution with Christianity in a very more modern sense, something I hadn't twigged before. I liked the comment about telling the truth and not worrying to go for change, because that really hit me, because I tend to be a bit, not quite aggressive, I wouldn't say, but I'd rather hope I could change people's minds. And I think you'll tell the truth rang a bell with me. And even more so, to read the Bible with Jesus as the norm. I think that's a very useful comment. But like Adrian, I'm sure many of us have actually not had the privilege of seeing you face to face. but will have enjoyed the evening, hearing you and seeing you is something which is something more than just reading a book. And I think that was very, very important. I find you an inspiration to us all. And now I hope that all the participants will join me in applauding you, either by icon or by hand. Thank you very much. I hand back to Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's only to say thank you, everybody, for your time tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you aren't a member of PCN, we'd love you to join us. So thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.